This video is the second in a series on how we can use the Virtual Studio production kit from Epic Games in Unreal Engine to build a virtual live production stage or studio, essentially using Epic's Virtual Studio kit like a Lego kit. Now, to get to this point, there was a previous video, so check the description for links to the videos that come before and after this one. For now, we're just going to take a quick look at what exactly is in the Virtual Studio kit, and along the way, we'll learn a little bit about Unreal Engine itself. So I've already migrated the Virtual Studio kit folder from the Virtual Studio project into my brand new project. And so if I double click into there, we'll see that there's a number of folders, and these folders are genuine folders on my file system, and they contain files that define the kit, essentially the pieces that we could use to build our studio. Now, some of these we really won't need to get into. IES has a definition for a particular engineering spec for a light fixture. Textures is something we might dig into at some other time, but essentially these are all 2D images that are used to build into materials. Materials, if I double click them, are actually the surface characteristics of any piece that we put into a level. So what happens to light when it reflects? Is the light mostly absorbed? Is there paint that's reflecting a color? Is it metallic or not? Is it kind of like stone? Does it have bumps? All these kinds of parameters that define whether an object, looks like concrete, or if that very same object is a glossy floor. These are defined by these materials. These materials do not define the shape of our pieces. They only define what happens to light reflecting off of the surface of the pieces themselves. Going back out to the Virtual Studio kit here, I can look at the meshes themselves, and if I double click in here, these folders contain the pieces that we'll use to build our own stage. So for example, I could go to floors. If I double click in here, there's several different meshes, actors, objects, to define floors. So if I were to double click on one of these, I can get a detailed view of them. This area in any window is called the Viewport. I can use my mouse wheel to roll back and roll forward to take a good look at this. I hold my Alt and left mouse button and click and drag to orbit around the object. If I let go of the Alt key and just use my right mouse button, I actually pan from the camera's position. If I left mouse click and drag, I'm also panning left and right, but I can move my mouse forward and backward to kind of truck the camera forward and backward. And middle mouse drag is kind of a pan or slide side to side or slide up and down. And these controls work in any viewport. So again, I double clicked this floor piece and we can see that it's just a square floor and it's made of wood. I can double click on another piece and you'll note that it is about the same shape, but it has multiple materials on it. You can see over here in the details side of the window that there are two materials that are in this particular object. One's metallic and one's wooden. Where these materials appear on the mesh is predefined. That's part of the definition of this piece. But we have the flexibility of adjusting these materials once we place these objects into our stage. Let's take a look at just a couple other things here. I highly encourage you to explore all of these folders and look at all the different pieces and things that are available in here to use as props and set pieces. Just like with a Lego kit, it's fun to know what pieces you have before you start really building your project. And to learn a little bit about how those pieces could be used, I'm going to go back out to the Virtual Studio kit and go into the Maps folder. Where Maps is it contains several pre-built studios. So the Tracklist Studio, for example, if I double click that, I'm actually going to load a pre-built studio. This one in particular is probably the most elaborate and the most thoroughly designed, most dramatic of the studios that are here as an example. And this is completely already built by professional designers. You'll notice that there's lots of icons floating around in the space. This is just because we're in editor mode and they kind of cue us into the location of some objects that might not normally be visible. They're not actually physical shape objects that we see in the space, but rather virtual. So for example, this right here, I can click it and select it, and it's actually a spotlight. It's floating in space, and it defines this light that's being shined down onto the floor. However, there isn't actually a physical light bulb that appears here. So if I go to the Show button here in my viewport and go to Sprites, all these objects here are sprites, I can just hide them all. And now I can't see that. Like there's no actual light floating there in space. And so that's what the sprites are for, is just to clue us in to the location of actors, which is the generic term for objects within our scene, while I'm in editor mode, so I can select things that might not be readily visible physically. So this is the Tracklist Studio. I'll just double click on Studio A. I definitely recommend you take a look at all of these studios. I'm going to choose Don't Save for any changes that I just made. Studio B, C, and D are also completely different studios. So there's actually 5 different studios built in here. You can go ahead into the Studio Gym. It's really just a collection of some of the pieces from the Meshes folder, and the virtual set is extremely simplified. So here in Studio A, we can get a look at some of the different layout objects that are in our Meshes toolkit. And one example just wanted to share is coming up to, I'll select this object, I'll tap F to frame that up in the middle of my viewer, and then Alt left mouse click to kind of pan around. And you'll note that this is selected, and then over here, this is my world outliner. There's an entry here for every single object, actor, mesh, whatever you want to call it, in this studio. So if I click this, it's selected here in my world outliner. I can see this is modular kit wall. And by the way, if I go into Virtual Studio Kit, meshes, and go into walls, sure enough, this is actually a facade. Interestingly, they named it wall, but if I go back to meshes and go to facade, you can see here's that facade. It's exactly this shape. And you'll note that this is originally made of wood, but in this view, I can look in my details area and see that there's a red glossy material applied. And one other interesting thing is, even though there's only one of these facades, it looks like there's 2 different ones here in the scene. And this is achieved by a little trick. Again, if I'm over here in my details, I can scroll downward and upward. At the top is the transformations, meaning the location, where in the scene is it located, rotations, has it been spun at all, and the scale. So this object matches this original, and its scale is 1, 1, and just a little bit less than 1. By the way, our axes, X is left to right in our scene, Y is front to back, and Z is up and down. And you'll see that, actually I'm rotated with the camera. If I rotate this way, you'll see these indicated by red, green, and blue, X, Y, and Z. And so this is my X direction, and this is my Y direction, and my Z direction vertically. This is in the world space. You can see there's a little world button here in the viewport. If I click that, I'll switch to object space. Again, Alt left click to kind of view this. So now we can see, with reference to the object, this is a little cube, the x-axis is left to right now relative to my camera. The y is front to back, and still the z is vertical. So again, notice that this is scaled 1, 1, and almost 1. If I select this other object, the scale is -1, 1, 1. So the designer here actually duplicated this object and just scaled it in the x direction by -1, effectively mirroring it. So I just wanted to show that as a tip as you're thinking about your potential studio, looking through the different meshes that exist and the pieces that you can use. Understand that you can rotate, position, and even scale them in any way you like. So that's a quick tour. I highly encourage you to explore all the studios, all the meshes, all the materials. And in the next video, we'll get started on building out our own stage. Until then, have fun.